Hi, it's Arjun with a video this week titled, Can You Trust the UN on Energy and Climate? And the catalyst was this warning label that, to my surprise, showed up on Super Spike Videopod episode 37 titled, Goodbye Europe, Hello Rest of the World. That was a video that discussed Barclays had a new climate impact statement that I thought was a little bit challenged in terms of what it proposed. I talked about Germany, industrial production, deindustrialization. And then I think I also had some comments on US and Canada and the outlook for energy and so forth. And, I get that YouTube and some of these big tech platforms put these warning labels when people are talking about what are viewed as sensitive subjects. But my issue really with this, aside from being a little insulted that I required a warning label, I consider myself to be pragmatic, balanced, and considering of all views. But that aside, it was actually the link to the United Nations. Now, the statement here, climate change refers to long-term shifts. This whole sentence that I have here is reasonable enough. But if you click on this link, and I'll provide it in this video, and go to what were supposedly the facts around climate and energy and some myth busters, I have some major issues with the 16 facts that they presented, as I suppose the intention was to provide clarity or alternative viewpoints versus my specific viewpoint. And I'm going to push back on probably at least 12, if not 14 of the facts that were highlighted. You can decide for yourself, and I would encourage people to go and read the full disclosures and comments that are made on their website. I think all of this is part of a bigger theme that we're kind of coming across here at Super Spiked, which is this issue of the big institutions that the world has relied on, that as an analyst I've relied on, folks like the IEA and others, where many of them have morphed, or at least portions of the organization, I should say, have morphed from being purely analysts and providing data and thought to actually being quasi-advocates, if not full-on advocates, and in this case, about climate solutions and so forth. And I've already spent a lot of time talking about the IEA's Net Zero by 2050 report series, which, while caveated as a scenario with lots of caveats and so forth, has been default advocacy. It's been treated as an actual forecast by banks and others to then come to conclusions that they should limit financing to a whole host of traditional energy companies or certain regions. So that report to me has been willfully weaponized. I do want to always say that the IEA is a big organization. Their monthly oil market report and the historical data they provide is still best in class, and I rely on it. So I'm going to differentiate that from some of the advocacy that comes from their leader, as well as this specific report series, Net Zero by 2050. I spent a lot of time on the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. Now, this is, in fairness, purposefully climate action oriented. It's headed by Mark Carney, who has been a senior central banker, Bank of England, I want to say Bank of Canada, a very sort of well-known figure in banking circles. And he's tried to create this alliance of commercial banks with the goal of having them have emissions finance targets, which would, over a reasonably short period of times, by 2030, by 2040, by 2050, basically stop financing traditional energy. Now, of course, the banks that are part of this alliance are primarily US, Canadian, European banks. There are some ones in Asia and other parts of the world. And of course, the companies impacted tend to be in allied countries, places like the United States, Canada, and Europe, in terms of traditional energy companies that would be negatively impacted by it. I've spent a lot of time talking about GFANZ, another sort of major organization that I think does not provide objective energy and climate perspectives, and I'm wholeheartly against the policies that they propose. Just last week, I talked about ESG at investment banks and asset managers. I'd refer to that post, but huge issues with the bank ESG and sustainability groups. And as I noted last week, I do differentiate between some of the underlying themes. Something like governance absolutely matters. I've always cared about the health, safety, and environmental performance of traditional energies companies I covered. But when you're part of these bank sustainability groups, ESG has morphed into de facto climate-only advocacy. And I've got a huge issue with where ESG, as it currently stands, has morphed into. And I think it's causing banks to stop creating loans, providing capital markets activity, just based on the merits of profits. And we're switching to where increasingly things are being done in the name of climate. And I think that's a huge risk to society. What I want to focus on in this video is really the United Nations. The United Nations is not an organization I don't think I've spent any time talking about it in super spiked. They don't really provide data that an analyst provides. That's something the IEA does, so I've been focused on them. GFANZ has impacted potentially the financing of companies, and the bank ESG sustainability groups. I used to work, of course, at Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, and so I'm familiar with how they can or cannot impact investments and what stocks people own and so forth. But the United Nations, of course, is a very important organization when it comes to energy and climate. Let me just pull up the next bullet. The UN, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, is the UN body for assessing the science related to climate change. So when I get this warning label on my video, and it links to the United Nations Mythbusters, the facts on climate and energy, and this is the organization that oversees the IPCC, which is responsible for doing the overwhelming majority of work that everyone cites on this issue of climate change and what is its trajectory, how quickly are things warming, what is the relationship between that and extreme weather and so forth. I see some major issues with what the UN is providing and what it calls the facts on climate and energy. Yet this is the organization that oversees the IPCC, and it raises the question, putting Antonio Guterres aside, who's the head of the UN, who's had some very hyperbolic comments, is probably the nicest way to say it. Global boiling was one of his comments. His, really vicious attacks on traditional energy companies that are providing 80% of the energy that the world needs for current economic activity. Putting those vicious comments aside, I think you have to ask yourself, is the UN an advocacy organization, or is this true analysis? And maybe it's a mixture. Maybe it's like the IEA, where you have groups that I think do really good fundamental work. The Oil Market Report team, as an example, they actually do some excellent natural gas work as well, and on some of the other commodities. And perhaps folks like Fatih Birol is sort of an outlier. But I think it raises questions. We've got huge issues with institutional advocacy from what used to be objective organizations. But let me go through what are 16 facts provided in this Mythbusters. I'm going to try my best to be calm when I'm doing this. We're going to go with peace, love, and unity as best as we can. I don't know if I'm going to succeed, but I'm going to try. And let me go through some of these 16 facts and really think for yourself, decide for yourself. I'm going to give you my opinion on these things. You decide for yourself. So again, there were 16 facts presented in this Mythbusters, the facts on climate and energy. And I apologize that I'm going to occasionally look down at my iPad because I want to be accurate and I want to read from their actual website when I need to. But let's go through the first two facts. There's 16 in total. I think these first two and maybe the first four are, I'm going to call them uncontroversial, or they certainly don't bother me. So the first fact is climate change is happening. The second fact is climate change is caused by human activity. I'm a disciple of Vaclav Smil. I'm a big fan of folks like Dr. Steve Koonin, as well as Bjorn Lomborg. And I listen to a range of folks at places I'm affiliated with, like Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy. I have a huge affection for Oxford Energy Institute. There are numerous different sources that discuss climate and energy. And I'm going to say that this I agree with. I have no issues with this. I think it's indisputable that when you burn a fossil fuel, the carbon goes into the atmosphere, they're heat-trapping gases, and it will lead to some degree of warming. We can certainly debate the magnitude, we can debate timeframes, we can debate with how and when and in which manner we should deal with this stuff. But I'm going to call these two facts that I think are facts. No issues. We're off to a good start, actually. Facts 3 and 4. And here we start, I think, on the margin, moving from facts to a little bit of advocacy, but give me a chance here. Scientists agree that humans are responsible for climate change is number 3. Every fraction of a degree warming matters. And so I'm going to say it's reasonable for the UN to have this view. When we say that scientists agree that humans are responsible for climate change, I think that is a very, very, very large majority of scientists would agree with that. Where there is disagreement is on the exact trajectory of how much we're warming, the exact relationship between warming and things like hurricanes, tornadoes, droughts, and a whole bunch of different effects that are perceived to, or some people will say, come from this warming activity. There's different views on what is an acceptable or unacceptable degree of warming. There's different debates on what amount of warming over what period of time would be more problematic or less problematic. when the UN, and if you read what they say, these are facts 3 and 4. What this starts to get into is the weaponization of climate change, where if you don't agree that it's an urgent climate crisis, if you don't support 100% electric vehicle ban by some year, if for some reason you are against the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, that you are therefore a climate denier. Now, they don't say that in here. I want to be perfectly clear. But when you see the practical effects, what these facts 3 and 4 start getting to is that type of ideology, and it's problematic. It's a huge problem. It's in the same way that the IEA's net zero by 2050 report has been weaponized willfully. That is not an accident. They can say they caveated it. They can say it's just a scenario. It has absolutely been weaponized. It's causing companies to halt financing and take what I think are ultimately unfortunate actions. That to me is how I interpreted what the effect of these two, quote, facts are. But that's my opinion. You can decide for yourself. Let's go to facts 5 and 6. The climate is changing faster than humans, plants, and animals can adapt. Climate is a major threat to people's health. They're calling these facts. These are undeniably not true. They're demonstrably false. Since the Industrial Revolution, okay? Since this period of time where we have been burning a whole bunch of coal, oil, and now natural gas, the world is richer. Less people are living in poverty. But when it comes to adaptation and health specifically, people are living longer. People live much longer today than they did pre-industrial revolution. That is not a fact. It's not even an opinion. The fact is people are actually healthier today. Some of it's through new technology and medicine making progress. Almost all of that has been enabled by energy, but let's give the medical doctors credit for some of this stuff too. So some of it's societal progress, medical technology, all powered by energy. Climate is changing faster than people adapt. The opposite is true. When you're richer, you do have a greater ability to adapt. And we should care about those that are impoverished today, who, whether we have more climate change or do not have more climate change, are subject to the climate that they live in and subject to unfortunate circumstances. We need to make the world richer. And you do that by using more energy and having a healthy discussion about energy. People are living longer today. Fewer people die today from extreme weather than did 100 years ago. And I want to be clear when I say that. That does not mean that in the future, more people might not die and that we shouldn't care about warming. I'm not saying that. I don't agree with sort of the right-wing pushback that says just because climate deaths are way down, we therefore shouldn't be concerned going forward. But factually, we've actually adapted extremely well so far. And you can say it's a matter of opinion. Maybe we won't adapt as well going forward. I think all the evidence points to when you're richer, you have a chance to adapt. Look at a country like China. Does anyone think they're worse off from an adaptation point today than they were 20 years ago when they were much poorer? Or take, in my lifetime, the country that has gone from poor to middle class to rich, South Korea. There is zero doubt. South Korea and the folks that live there are going to be better able to adapt to climate change today than they were when they were a poor country 55 years ago. These are not facts. These are barely opinions, and large portions of these statements are demonstrably false. You can have an opinion on what the future may hold. This is, I'm sorry, peace, love, and unity. Peace, love, and unity. We're going to try and calm down here. Fact number 7, natural gas is a fossil fuel, not a clean source of energy. I better make sure I quote on this one. This is the one that actually really I found, I think, most upsetting. Again, I just went through the health one, which I think is a falsehood in this UN document. But this, again, this is clear advocacy. When you go through all 16 of these facts, and I encourage people to read them, it really is a call that wind and solar are the 100% answer. And they do allow for some other technologies. That demonstrably is not true either. There is zero chance you're powering a global economy just on wind and solar. I do think it's possible someday you will move off crude oil and maybe even natural gas. It's possible in some decade or century, probably century. Could it be very different? Nuclear, some future technology we can't imagine today. There's no guarantee any of this stuff is going to be used forever. But this line that natural gas is a fossil fuel, not a clean source of energy, when this has probably been the #1 reason in the United States our carbon emissions have gone down. We have done as well, if not outperformed Europe. The United States has done well, if not outperformed Europe. It bears repeating, and it's thanks to natural gas. Could natural gas be even cleaner, meaning dealing with methane and venting, all this kind of stuff? Absolutely. But I want to say this statement that natural gas is a fossil fuel and not a clean source of energy, clear tell that this is advocacy. Clean energy is fact number 8. Clean energy technologies produce far less carbon pollution than fossil fuels. My issue with this statement is the use of the phrasing carbon pollution. We know that carbon is critical to human life. Without carbon, we won't be able to live on Earth. I think that's the issue with Mars, if I'm not mistaken. I think Venus is the opposite example, too much carbon. So somewhere between Mars and Venus, here we are, if I got my planets right, here we are on Earth. This is one of the areas where I think those who are most passionate about addressing climate change go wrong. When you burn crude oil, you do get air particulates, things like NOx and SOx. When you burn coal, you get a whole bunch of other air particulates, and you can get, quote, dirty, polluted air. That type of air pollution deserves to be cleaned up. That's actual pollution. Carbon is critical to human life, so we can certainly debate, when do we have too much carbon in the atmosphere, and should we decarbonize and control for it? But calling carbon pollution is an inaccurate use of language, and it's one of the challenges with this energy and climate debate. All right, fact number 9. Entire countries already rely on nearly 100% renewable energy. And the countries cited: Costa Rica, Norway, Iceland, Paraguay, and Uruguay. Now, factually, that is probably a true statement. But come on, if you are a moderate Democrat who is passionate about climate, do you think this is not misleading? Do you think because Norway and Iceland are nearly 100% renewable energy, Iceland, small country, geothermal, some hydro, Norway, I think it's overwhelmingly hydro that drives this otherwise true statement. These are small countries with a handful of millions of people. There's no chance you can use these examples as what would scale up for the United States or the rest of Europe. Never mind 1.4 billion people in China, 1.4 billion people in India, 1.4 billion people in Africa, etc. This is advocacy and misleading rhetoric at its worst. It's actually comical. Again, we're going to try and stick with peace, love, and unity. You can't take this seriously. This is fact number 9. This is extremely misleading. How can this be in this document? Number 10. Renewable energy will soon be the world's top source of electricity. They've got a graph here. I've not been able to fact check this graph, so I'm gonna accept this. I think it's possible that there is a century where, in terms of electricity percentages, this could be true, especially if I add in, if I personally count nuclear as part of low carbon energy, and if I count geothermal in there, then perhaps this can be true. We're not gonna fight on that one. Discuss it. Fact number 11: renewable energy is cheaper than fossil fuels. Again, demonstrably misleading at best. I'm going to say false. When something like solar is a small portion of your electricity mix, and all that matters is the profits of that incremental solar panel, that is in all likelihood very low cost. And so on that basis, in that specific example, it's a true case. When you start getting to where with solar, you need to build new transmission lines, and where it's a large enough portion of your electricity mix that you need to allow for the periods that the sun's not shining with backup storage. And that could be battery storage, which of course is very expensive if you're going to do it at the scale of a full big city, let alone state, let alone country. Or we're talking about backup natural gas or coal. Renewable energy is actually very, very expensive. And so the percentages matter, the context matters. On an individual unit basis, if that's all you're counting on, it is certainly possible, if not plausible, that in the best areas is a true statement. But the implication that everywhere in all circumstances, renewable energy is cheaper than fossil fuels is absolutely a false statement. It's one of my biggest issues with those of you who are sort of urgent climate crisis people saying it's cheaper to save the world with renewable energy than continue on. That is not true. It's just not true. If you really are passionate about climate, you have to be honest about these assessments. We don't have battery storage today solved. It could be solved someday. It's not solved today. You don't have the copper today to get to 100% electric vehicles by 2035. That goes back to every fraction of degree matters, act urgently. You're getting this stuff to be more expensive because you're rushing it. Let it grow naturally. It should compete on its own and let systems develop on their own. and then it probably can gain share. But it is not true that renewable energy is cheaper than fossil fuels in all cases. You could not be anywhere near 100% with renewable energy today and have this be a true statement. This is, in the best case, it's misleading. Fact number 12, solar panels and wind turbines make good use of land. Now, you got to pull up the website. There is a picture of a solar panel elevated over some crops. This is ridiculous. This is a joke. No one confuses me for a diehard environmentalist, but even I know that biodiversity matters. And there is an inverse correlation between all forms of energy and biodiversity, but in particular, the land mass needed for solar panels especially, but also wind turbines. And that is negatively correlated to biodiversity. To say it makes a good use of land is a joke. I mean, I got to calm down. This is very funny. This is a funny picture. This is ridiculous. This is one of the 12 facts used to check my video. You got to be kidding me. Fact 13, renewable energy is better at withstanding extreme weather events. Now, this is unquestionably an opinion, not a fact. Now, they cite the cold weather, the freeze that happened in Houston a couple of years ago, where the natural gas was not weatherized and it froze and underperformed. And I think shame on the gas industry for not weatherizing ahead of that storm. I think there was a storm a decade earlier where there was an opportunity to recognize that this could be an issue, but I think that's hopefully happened now. But to just say that renewable energy is better at withstanding, that's not proven. It may be better in some cases. It may not be better in other cases. It doesn't mean you only always want fossil fuels, but that is in the best case, this is a possibility. It's hardly a fact. Maybe it's an opinion. Maybe it was true in that Houston freeze. But again, to have this be one of the facts on climate change, fact number 13 is pretty preposterous. The transition to clean energy will create millions of jobs. This is an opinion. It's not a fact. It could come true. I don't doubt that you could have millions of jobs, but I'm going to say advocacy, not fact. This is a big one. Fact 15. We're almost done, folks. Alternatives to petroleum-based products already exist. That is technically true. It is absolutely and wholeheartedly, and it's not even a close call. It is not true when you're talking about scaling up from what works in a science lab to what works at pilot to what works at scale for cities, let alone states, let alone economies, let alone billion people type populations. That is not true. Okay, lots of stuff works in the lab. I always use the example that 20 years ago, Goldman Sachs asked me to look at some cellulosic ethanol producers. That was a technology that was always 5 years away. Today, as best as I can add it up, we have zero cellulosic ethanol. And so, yes, alternatives exist. Look at renewable diesel. The feedstock is double the cost of the diesel selling price, and so you need a 100% tax credit to get companies to do those projects. Look at sustainable aviation fuel, 5 to 10x higher feedstock costs relative to output price. None of that stuff is ready to scale. I will actually give credit to electric vehicles worldwide, where there are some subsidies for purchases to get a discount. By and large, that's a technology that does work. I'm going to say that's one thing that I do think has some relevance. Solar at a small scale works. It's when you start having to deal with intermittency at a grid-wide level that it starts becoming much more expensive. So again, sizing matters too. The pace of development matters. It doesn't mean no alternatives at scale will ever exist, but this is an extremely misleading statement when you do not consider costs and other variables. And the last fact is we can still limit climate change if we act now. Tell me that is not advocacy. That's a fact. I don't even think it's true. I mean, just based on the science, once you put carbon in the atmosphere, it lasts for a long period of time, hundreds of years. So I don't even think this is true, even if we acted now. Again, advocacy. So these 16 facts were used to check my video, and I am personally insulted by it. Barely any of these are actually facts. Maybe the first four, some of these are outright wrong. Most of this is in best case opinion, and all of it's essentially advocacy and ideology, a huge red flag about what it means to rely on the United Nations. Can you rely on the United Nations on climate energy was my question. I'm going to say, I don't think you can. What I would like to provide, though, is some alternate sources if people did think that my video required some sort of checking on it. The first I'd suggest is actually Vaclav Smil. He's an actual scientist. He's a professor, or perhaps retired now, at the University of Manitoba. Awesome series of books. He's absolutely an energy expert. He certainly agrees that since the Industrial Revolution, we've put a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere. It's got a special marking relative to the organic carbon cycle, if you will. And he will certainly agree that there is a relationship between the warming we've had and putting that carbon in the atmosphere. But even he says the future is very uncertain in terms of the exact path both CO2 emissions and warming will take, and how much that will lead to severe weather and extreme events, and how we should be dealing with it. He is, as well as his own understanding of what these renewable and alternative technologies mean from a cost standpoint. I would feel very good if, when I present on climate and energy, someone said, you know what? Don't just believe Arjun, go look at Vaclav Smil. Another set of sources that would have been better links would have actually been university think tanks. Now, by and large, many of these universities subscribe to urgent climate crisis, all this kind of left of center type thinking. But I actually don't have a problem with it because they're thoughtful and they're smart. And I am personally involved with Columbia's Center on Global Energy Policy. It's been one of my greatest joys to interact with the scholars there. They're smart people. We don't agree on everything, but I learn a lot from them. And I'm able to get pushback to my views. And I would like to think that I offer counter perspectives to their views. And I believe we're all better off for it. I would feel better if my video was fact-checked with a link to Columbia's Center on Global Energy. Same thing with Oxford. The Oxford Institute on Energy Studies, a tremendous organization. They're based obviously in Oxford University. I do speak at the Oxford Energy Seminar once a year, but huge fan of the research reports they put out. You have the Baker Institute at Rice does some good work, and there are probably many others, Stanford. Even if these university think tanks by and large are kind of left-leaning in this modern world we live in, at least they're doing intelligent work. And I guarantee not one of those university think tanks would say that Iceland is representative of a 100% renewable economy. That's something we can go to. I would rather have been checked by environmental NGOs. If people felt like my video needed a link, I have much greater respect for the Environmental Defense Fund, Ceres, and the Rocky Mountain Institute. Why? Because they are honest about who they are. They're environmental NGOs. This is their job. This is what they do. I know people at each of these institutions. I benefit from interacting with them, and I would much rather have their research as a check on my videos because it's actually good work. Again, it doesn't mean I agree with every one of their last conclusions. I am certainly someone who promotes economic growth as the world's overarching objective. And if we are all richer and if we are all using more energy, we will have cleaner air, cleaner water, et cetera. I think geopolitics will ultimately be the driver of moving to low carbon technologies. But if YouTube feels the need to put checks on my videos, I would be totally okay if EDF, Ceres, and RMI were the links of the research they went to, rather than this ridiculous UN 16 facts and mythbusters, which are a complete joke. So I'd like to end this video on a personal note. And I saw when I was opening up Twitter and X this morning that the longtime historic chairman of Chevron, I think from 1989 to 1999, Ken Derr had passed away. Ken was chairman and CEO of Chevron at the beginning of my career, which started in 1992. And while I was too junior and young to have directly interacted with him, he was of that vintage of CEOs. I spent a lot of time talking about Lee Raymond, who's a personal hero of mine in terms of how he ran Exxon in those days. But Lee Raymond, Lou Noto of Mobil, they were separate companies at the time, and Ken Derr of Chevron were three giants of the industry at that time. And I have some very good memories of some of the investor meetings that Ken Derr hosted. I can remember that they were amongst that group of companies, along with Exxon and Mobil, that were the first to recognize the need to put profitability improvement over volumes. And it was it's something the rest of industry has just caught up to. And we spend a lot of time, as you know, on Super Spike talking about it. We're talking mid-90s here. And this is coming off the 1986 oil bust. They were really, Chevron under Ken Derr was one of those leadership companies that focused on, we need to get our return on capitals up. We need to get our profitability up. We need to have sustainable dividend growth and not just be all about adding reserves and volumes and so forth. And I remember two specific things at the time. One was their downstream had some underperformance, and the head of downstream was actually a future CEO, Dave O'Reilly. And one of their big things was how downstream was going to go from kind of breaking even or very low returns to a 10 and then 12% return on capital. The other big thing he did was he got Chevron into Kazakhstan via Tengiz. Recall the Soviet Union had collapsed, the Berlin Wall had fallen a few years earlier. And one of the big questions would be, to what degree can American and European companies help develop some of these former Soviet reserves? It was controversial is not the right word, but it was risky. It's probably the right word for any of these, as big as these companies were, to go into places like Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan and so forth. And it was a risk that Ken Derr took that Chevron is still benefiting from 30 years later. So when you think about these things, when you think about M&A and transaction activity and the decisions that companies make, it really is never about how is the stock going to react today or tomorrow or next week. 30 years later, Tengiz is still a major asset for Chevron. I know they have a current expansion project. I know that project, I think last year it had some cost overrun or delay that caused some noisiness in the stock. This is a major legacy asset. And Chevron shareholders and employees are still benefiting from decisions that Ken Derr and his management team made now 30 years ago. And so I just wanted to spend a time recognizing that he was one of the giants of industry back then. One of the big things that a board of directors does is CEO succession. And I do want to compliment Chevron's board, as well as Ken Derr himself, for when you think about Chevron in my career, it was Ken Derr to Dave O'Reilly, to John Watson, to now Mike Wirth. That is as good of a CEO lineage as you're going to have probably in any company, in any industry, but certainly within the energy industry. So I'd just like to, again, think if you're a current Chevron employee, I'm in my mid-50s. I think people my age or older will certainly know and remember Ken Derr. But if you're younger, you are still benefiting from all the things he put into place, not just the assets, but how the company is run. The philosophy of management succession and promoting people and having best-in-class people from a range of backgrounds. That is Chevron, and it started under Ken Derr, at least from what I can remember from my career. And just wanted to express I don't personally know him or didn't personally know him, but to his family and friends for your loss. And for everyone at Chevron, he was an amazing leader. And, I'm sorry to have heard of his passing when I opened up Twitter this morning. Thank you.